Feel the heavy, metallic pulse of a story that beats with the rhythm of raw ambition in the search for truth. This is cinematic storytelling at its most intense, where every frame captures the heat of the human heart. Click subscribe now and feel the pulse of the story.
I put the phone down on the kitchen table and just sat there. My daughter Sandra was still talking. I could hear her voice coming out of the speaker. Something about square footage and property managers and making smart decisions while you still can. But I'd stopped listening somewhere around the part where she mentioned her financial advisor had already run the numbers on my house. I was 68 years old. My brother had been dead for 11 days. Let me back up, because if I start here, you won't understand how we got to this point, and understanding how we got here matters more than you might think. My name is Harold Briggs. I spent 34 years as a high school history teacher in Dayton, Ohio, and another 6 as a department head before my knees gave out, and I retired at 63. My wife Eleanor passed away from pancreatic cancer 4 years ago, so I've been on my own since then. We never had children together. She had a son from her first marriage, Daniel, who lives in Portland and calls on birthdays when he remembers. My family is this. I have 2 daughters from my first marriage. Sandra is 44. Lives in Columbus with her husband Phil, who does something in corporate insurance that he explains differently every time I ask. My younger daughter is Renee, 41, married to a man named Greg who flips houses in the Cleveland suburbs and always has a deal he's about to close. Sandra and Renee are close the way that people are close when they share the same goals. They talk every day. I learned a long time ago that if one of them knows something, both of them know it within the hour. Then there's my nephew, Caleb. He's 28. His father, my brother, was Thomas Briggs. Thomas was 66 when he died, a heart attack. Sudden, the way they always are, even when you think you're prepared for them. He'd retired 2 years earlier from 30 years as a forest ranger in northern Montana. He never married. He had Caleb with a woman named Iris who left when Caleb was 4, and Thomas raised that boy alone in a 2-bedroom cabin outside Whitefish with a wood stove and a dog named Sergeant, and enough patience for 10 fathers. Caleb grew up to be an electrician. He's quiet, practical, the kind of person who fixes things without being asked and never mentions it afterward. Thomas and I had gotten closer in the last decade than we'd been our whole lives. Something about Eleanor dying and his retirement. We started calling each other every Sunday, talked for an hour, sometimes 2. I knew his land better from those conversations than I knew my own backyard. He described the way the snow sat on the Swan Range in January, the elk that came down to the meadow behind his cabin in early spring, the creek that ran cold and clean through the lower pasture even in August. He loved that land the way some people love their children. He died on a Wednesday in March. Caleb found him in the armchair by the wood stove, with a cup of coffee gone cold on the side table, like he'd just sat down to rest. I drove to Montana for the service. Sandra and Renee did not come. Sandra sent flowers and a card. Renee texted me that she was sorry for my loss, which is a strange thing to say to someone about their own brother, but I've learned not to expect much better. The service was small. Some of Thomas's ranger colleagues, a few neighbors, people from the town. Caleb stood at the front and talked about his father for 20 minutes without notes, and I'm not ashamed to say I cried through most of it. Afterward, people brought food to the cabin, and we sat around telling Thomas stories until it got late. I drove home the following Monday. Sandra called that Wednesday, 11 days after Thomas died, like I said, and that phone call is where the story really starts. She wanted to talk about the property. I hadn't thought about it yet, honestly. Thomas's land, 340 acres outside Whitefish, with a cabin and a barn and a stretch of creek frontage that fishermen would have paid serious money to access, was the kind of thing you don't immediately think about in terms of dollar amounts when your brother has just died. But Sandra had been thinking about it. Clearly, she'd been thinking about it since before she sent those flowers. Phil had done some research, she said. Land in that part of Montana was selling for significant prices. The cabin itself was in good condition, if the estate was handled correctly, and she said correctly, with a particular emphasis that meant the way we want, there could be real value there for the whole family. I told her I didn't know the terms of Thomas's will yet, and that we should wait for the lawyer. She said, of course, she just wanted me to be aware of the options. I got off the phone and sat at my kitchen table for a long time. I called Caleb that evening. He was quiet on his end while I told him about the conversation. When I finished, he said, "She called me too. Earlier today, asked if I knew what was in the will. What did you tell her?" I told her I didn't know. A pause. "I do know, actually. Dad told me. He made me sit down last fall and walk through the whole thing with him. Said he wanted me to understand it before it happened so I wouldn't be surprised." Another pause, longer this time. "Uncle Harold, you should probably call the lawyer." The lawyer was a man named Robert Voss in Kalispell. I called him the next morning. Thomas had left a will, which I knew. What I didn't know, what Thomas had apparently been sitting on for 3 years, keeping it quiet the way he kept most important things quiet, was that he had also left a letter. Addressed to me specifically. Sealed, Robert Voss told me. He'd been instructed to mail it to my house after the service, and it should arrive within the day or two. It arrived on a Thursday. A regular envelope, my name in Thomas's handwriting, the return address the cabin in Whitefish. I sat down at the kitchen table before I opened it. Thomas's handwriting was like Thomas Spare, no wasted motion, every letter doing exactly what it needed to do. He'd written the letter 8 months before he died. "Harold," it started. "If you're reading this, I went ahead of you, which is fine. Don't spend too much time being sad about it. I had a good run. Now here's what you need to know before you do anything else." I read the letter 4 times. Then I called Robert Voss back and told them I was ready to hear the details. What Thomas had done was this. 3 years ago, after a routine checkup that turned up some early warning signs his doctor wanted to monitor, Thomas had quietly started planning. He'd always been methodical. 30 years as a ranger will do that to a person, and he'd applied that same methodical approach to making sure his affairs were in order. The land had been in our family since our grandfather bought it in 1962, passed to our father, and to Thomas when our father died. Thomas had paid it off completely by the time he retired. What I didn't know was that 2 years ago, Thomas had established a trust. He'd been watching the land market in the Flathead Valley for years, understood exactly what his 340 acres represented in real terms. He'd had an appraisal done quietly. He'd talked to an estate attorney and a tax advisor and a financial planner, all separately, over the course of several months, like a man researching a project. Because for Thomas, it was a project. Into this trust he had placed the land, the cabin, all the structures, and a separate investment account worth approximately $280,000, money from selling timber rights on the north end of the property years ago, money that had been quietly growing ever since. The trust named me as the primary beneficiary, with one condition, that Caleb would retain lifetime residency rights and first right of refusal if I ever chose to sell. Thomas had thought of everything. He'd even had the cabin's roof replaced and the plumbing updated the previous summer using a contractor from town, paid from the investment account. He told Caleb it was just routine maintenance, the family cabin. The one Sandra was already calling, the Montana property on the phone, the one Phil had apparently run numbers on, was not part of the estate that would go through probate. It was in the trust. Clear of debt, renovated, protected. Robert Voss read me the relevant sections in a calm, professional voice. When he finished, I sat in silence for a moment. "My daughters," I started, "are not named in the trust," he said. "Your brother was clear about his intentions. The property and the associated account transfer to you upon filing. It's straightforward." He never told them anything about this. He never told anyone except Caleb and me. A brief pause. He mentioned in our last meeting that he expected there might be some interest from other family members once the estate was announced. He wanted the structure to be, his word, bulletproof. I started laughing. I couldn't help it. Thomas, my careful, quiet brother, who had spent 30 years watching over 2 million acres of federal forest and never missed a single detail worth noticing. "What do I do now?" I asked. "Officially, nothing yet. I'll file the trust paperwork and that moves forward automatically. What you do personally is your business." He paused again. "Mrs. Your brother's letter, did he explain the second part?" I looked down at the pages in my hand. He started to walk me through it. Thomas had left the Dayton house, my house, alone. That was mine, mortgage-free for the past 6 years. What he had laid out in the letter was a plan, a suggestion, really, for what came next. He'd written it the way he used to plan trail routes, step by step, contingencies noted, alternatives provided. The plan was simple in concept. Don't tell Sandra and Renee about the trust yet. Let the official estate process play out. Thomas's personal belongings, his truck, his tools, a small savings account that was in his name alone and would go through probate in the normal way. That account had about $18,000 in it. The will divided that equally among Caleb, Sandra, and Renee, $6,000 each. Wait and watch, Thomas had written. You'll know when it's time. I understood what he meant. He knew his nieces. I was right to wait. Sandra called again 2 days later. She'd done more research, or Phil had, or they'd done it together. Those two share a brain when money is involved. She was warm, careful, the voice she used when she wanted something. She asked how I was doing. She asked about the service, which she hadn't attended. She asked if I'd heard from the lawyer, yet I said the estate was in process. She said that was good, that these things took time, that she just wanted to make sure I had good advisors. Because these situations could get complicated, and people sometimes made decisions from grief that they regretted later. She knew a financial planner in Columbus who was excellent, someone who specialized in estate transitions and could look at everything holistically. I said I'd keep that in mind. After I got off the phone, I called Caleb. Sandra talked to you again, he said before I could start. How did you know? She called me this morning, asked if I knew the value of the land, asked if Dad had any debts she should know about. A flat quiet on his end. I told her I didn't know. Same as before. Are you okay? I'm fine. He wasn't entirely fine. I could hear it. She called my dad's cell phone, Uncle Harold. He's been dead for 2 weeks, and she called his number like she forgot. I didn't say anything for a moment. I need about 3 more weeks, I said. Can you sit on this for 3 more weeks? I've been sitting on it since last October. Caleb said, I can sit a little longer. What happened over those 3 weeks was a gradual unwinding of any remaining uncertainty I had about my daughter's intentions. Renee called the following Tuesday. Her approach was different from Sandra's, more direct, less polished. Renee didn't bother with the warm-up. She said she'd been thinking, and she hoped I didn't mind her being honest. She said she and Greg were stretched thin right now. A deal in Mentor had fallen through, and they had some bridge financing coming due, and she wasn't trying to make this about money. She knew the timing was terrible, but if there was any possibility of liquidating Uncle Thomas's estate quickly, the land, the cabin, whatever the estate consisted of, and if that resulted in any distribution to family members, even a partial advance, it would really help them right now. I said I understood. She said she knew I did, that I'd always been understanding, that she loved me. I said I loved her too. I meant it. You can love someone and still see them clearly. The call that crystallized everything came 10 days later from Sandra. She and Renee had apparently coordinated, because the conversation had a rehearsed quality to it. Specific numbers, specific talking points. She mentioned that she'd had a conversation with a real estate attorney who specialized in Montana properties, and he'd confirmed that the land Thomas owned could likely fetch between $1.8 and $2.1 million in the current market. She mentioned that, if the estate was handled correctly, and if I was willing to serve as executor in a cooperative way, the distribution process could be quite quick. Distribution to whom? I asked. Well, to the family, she said. To the people Thomas would have wanted taken care of. I thought about what Thomas would have wanted very carefully. Thomas had met Sandra and Renee at family gatherings over the years. Christmas, when they still did Christmas together. A few funerals, a wedding. He had been unfailingly polite to them. He had also, in 34 years of Sunday phone calls, never once asked about them by name without being prompted. He had asked about Caleb in every single conversation. I told Sandra I'd be in touch. Then I called Robert Voss and told him I was ready to move. The timing required care. I needed to look like a grieving, slightly overwhelmed older man who was slowly coming around to practical realities, which wasn't entirely a performance because I was grieving, just not overwhelmed. I called Sandra back and told her she was right, that this was a lot to manage alone, that I appreciated her support. I let some confusion into my voice when she asked about the lawyer. I said things were complicated, that I was having trouble understanding all the paperwork. She offered to fly up to Dayton the following weekend to help me sort through things. I said that would be wonderful. She came on a Saturday with Phil. Renee drove up from Cleveland with Greg. I hadn't asked for both of them, but I wasn't surprised. I had coffee and pastries on the table when they arrived. I looked tired. I was tired. I'd spent the previous week working with Robert Voss on the paperwork and making 2 quiet trips to a storage unit across town, where I'd been gradually moving things that mattered to me. Thomas's letters, his ranger logbooks that I'd brought back from the cabin, Eleanor's jewelry, my father's watch, the photo albums that lived on the bookshelf in the hallway. Just the things you couldn't replace. We sat around the table, and Sandra laid out what she called a practical path forward. She had a printed document. Phil had prepared it, apparently. It outlined the steps to settle Thomas's estate, engage a Montana real estate agent they'd already identified, and this was on page 2, almost buried. Establish a family LLC that would manage the distribution of proceeds in a tax-efficient manner. I looked at the LLC section for a while without saying anything. This would give all of us a stake in the process, Phil explained. He had a way of explaining things that made them sound reasonable until you thought about them for an extra 30 seconds. Rather than a single executor making all the decisions, we'd all have a voice. That seems fair, I said. Sandra smiled. She had a particular smile that reached her eyes when she thought she was winning. There's one thing I want to make sure I understand, I said. I looked at the document. This LLC, it would manage the proceeds from the estate. From the property sale, primarily, Phil said, and any other assets. And the distribution would be equal shares, Sandra said quickly, among all direct family. You, me, Renee, Caleb, of course. She said Caleb's name with a slight hesitation, the kind you notice when you know someone well. I nodded slowly. And what about the cabin itself? Before it sells, I mean. Someone would need to manage it, maintain it. We'd hire a property manager, Renee said. This was the first thing she'd said since we sat down. She'd been watching me carefully, which I'd noticed. Greg knows people who handle vacation rentals. The place would pay for itself while it's on the market, easy. I looked at them. My daughters, their husbands. Sandra in her blazer, Phil with his reading glasses, Renee with her hands wrapped around her coffee mug, Greg leaning back in his chair, in my kitchen, where Thomas and I had talked on the phone every Sunday for 10 years. Let me think about it over the week, I said. Can I keep this? I held up the printed document. Of course, Sandra said. Take all the time I needed. They left by 4 o'clock. I stood in the kitchen and listened to the cars pulling out of the driveway. Then I called Caleb. It's time, I said. Caleb arrived in Dayton the following Tuesday in his truck with 2 empty duffel bags and a box of Thomas's things he thought I might want. A framed photograph of the 2 of us at the cabin from maybe 15 years ago, Thomas's compass, a small carved wooden elk our father had made when we were boys. I made dinner and we sat at the table for 3 hours talking. I showed him Robert Voss's paperwork. I showed him Thomas's letter. He read it twice the way Thomas used to read things, carefully, without rushing. He wrote this 8 months ago, Caleb said. September, looks like. He took me fishing in August. We were out on the Clark Fork for 2 days. He set the letter down. He didn't say a word about any of this. That was your father, I said. Caleb nodded. He picked up the carved elk and turned it over in his hands. What do you need from me? Just keep being exactly what you are, I said, and be at the house next Saturday. The final conversation happened on a Saturday morning, 3 weeks after Sandra and Phil's visit. I'd called them myself, told them I'd made a decision. Sandra and Renee arrived within 20 minutes of each other. Phil and Greg came with them. Caleb was in the living room when they got there, sitting in the armchair by the window. They said hello to him the way you say hello to someone in a waiting room. I let them get settled. Coffee. The pleasantries. Then I sat down. "I've made a decision about Thomas's estate," I said. Sandra leaned forward slightly. Renee had her hands in her lap. "The property in Montana," I continued, "the cabin and the land. I'm keeping it." A beat of silence. "Keeping it," Sandra repeated. "Moving there, actually." I said it calmly, the way you say something you've been sure about for long enough that the certainty has gone quiet and settled. "I've already filed the transfer paperwork through Robert Voss. The trust clears within the next 2 weeks. Caleb stays on the property. That's part of the trust terms, and I'll be moving in this summer." "Dad." Renee's voice was flat. "That land is worth $2 million. Approximately, yes. You're 68 years old. You're going to move to Montana by yourself and manage 340 acres? Caleb will be there," I said. "And it turns out 34 years of teaching teenagers how to manage complicated situations is decent preparation for most things." Phil cleared his throat. "Harold, I don't think you fully understand the financial implications." "I understand them clearly," I said. "We had a plan," Sandra said. Her voice had shifted. The warmth was gone. The careful tone gone. "We talked about this. We were going to work together," I said. "I know. I heard the plan. You said you'd think about it." "I did think about it. This is what I thought." "There was a document," Phil said. "The LLC structure we put together. I'm not signing any LLC documents," I said. "Thomas left his land to me. What I do with it is my decision." "The distribution," Renee started. "There is no distribution," I said. "Thomas's will distributes his personal savings equally. $6,000 each to you, to Sandra, and to Caleb. That's the estate. Everything else was in a trust that names me as beneficiary. The paperwork is done. It's filed. Robert Voss's number is on the refrigerator if you'd like to verify any of this." The silence in the room had a texture to it. "He hid it," Sandra said finally. "Uncle Thomas hid the assets so he couldn't. He organized his affairs the way he wanted to," I said. "It's his land, his money, his decision. You're cutting us out." Her voice cracked at the end. There were genuine tears in her eyes. I recognized them because I'd seen Sandra cry since she was 4 years old, and I knew the difference between the kind that comes from hurt and the kind that comes from something not going the way she planned. These were the second kind. "After everything." "After what, specifically?" I asked, gently, genuinely. She didn't answer. "I'm not cutting you out of anything," I said. "You're my daughters. Nothing changes that. But Thomas's land is not yours to plan around, and my decisions about my own future are not yours to manage." Greg, who hadn't spoken at all, stood up. "This is a waste of time," he said, and he walked out. Renee followed him without looking at me. Sandra stayed a moment longer. Phil was already gathering his jacket. "You could have told us," she said. "You let us think." "I let you show me what you were thinking," I said. "That's different." She left. I heard the cars in the driveway. Caleb and I sat there while the sound faded, and then it was just the kitchen, the morning light, the coffee getting cold. "You okay?" Caleb asked. I thought about it honestly. There was grief in it. A specific kind, not for the land or the money or any of that, but for the version of my daughters I'd been giving the benefit of the doubt to for years. Every parent does this. You see the person you want to see alongside the person who's actually there, and you keep hoping the distance between the two will close. Sometimes it doesn't. "I will be," I said. "Give me a few minutes." He gave me the few minutes. He got up and washed both our mugs without being asked. The movers came 3 weeks later. Not for the Dayton house. I rented that to a young couple, a school teacher and a nurse, and kept it in my name. The movers came for everything I wanted in Montana. The leather chair from the study, the bookshelf and the books, Eleanor's piano, which I didn't play but couldn't leave, Thomas's framed photograph, the carved elk, my father's watch. Caleb drove me to Montana in his truck. We took 2 days, stopped in Billings overnight, ate bad diner food, talked about Thomas and about Caleb's mother and about the first time I'd visited the cabin, which was the summer I turned 30 and Thomas had just gotten the ranger job, and everything felt like it was beginning. The cabin was everything Thomas had described to me in 10 years of Sunday phone calls. And also, nothing like I'd imagined. The way real places are always more specific than the pictures in your mind. The Swan Range was right there, immediate and enormous. The kind of landscape that makes your inner monologue go quiet. The main cabin had a deep porch facing west. The meadow ran down to the creek, which ran cold and clear over rounded stones. In the evenings, the light went gold, and then orange, and then the mountains turned purple, and the stars came out thick. Thomas had left the furniture in the main cabin, his chair by the wood stove, his desk in the corner, his bookshelves, packed with field guides in natural history and the handful of novels he'd returned to throughout his life. I found a copy of A River Runs Through It with his handwriting in the margins. I sat in his chair and read half of it that first night. Caleb lived in the smaller cabin 40 yards from the main house, the one Thomas had built when Caleb graduated high school. He came for dinner most evenings. We had a comfortable rhythm within the first week, the kind that takes years with most people, but felt natural with Caleb because we'd both been around Thomas long enough to absorb his habits. I started learning the land. I hired a local man named Dale who'd worked with Thomas as a seasonal ranger to show me the property, the fence lines, the water systems, the back meadow where the elk came down in spring. I wasn't a rancher and I didn't pretend to be one, but I was a person who'd spent 34 years learning things I didn't know, and this felt continuous with that. Sandra called 6 weeks after I moved. I was on the porch with coffee when my phone rang and her name came up. I let it ring once more than I normally would, not to be cruel, just to notice how I felt, and what I felt was steady. "How are you?" she asked. "Good," I said. "Really good, actually. The Montana thing is working out." It wasn't really a question. It's working out. A pause. The kind that has something waiting behind it. "Phil and I are separating," she said. I set my coffee down. "Sandra, I'm sorry. Are you?" A small laugh, but with some bitterness in it. "It's fine. It's, it is what it is." I didn't say what I was thinking, which was that Phil had always seemed like a man who was interested in Sandra's plans more than in Sandra herself, and that the plans hadn't worked out the way he'd expected. I didn't say it because it wouldn't help. "How are you doing with it?" I asked. "I don't know yet." A long pause. "Dad, I want to say something." "Okay. I want to say I'm sorry. About the whole thing. The way we came in with the documents and the LLC and all of it." "It was." She stopped. Started again. "Phil drove most of it, but I let him. I was already thinking about the numbers before Uncle Thomas was even buried. And I know that, and I'm ashamed of it." I watched a hawk move in wide circles above the meadow. The creek caught the light in the lower field. "I know you are," I said. "That's it? You're not going to—" "What do you want me to say, Sandra?" Another pause. "I don't know. Something." "You're my daughter," I said. "That doesn't change what happened, and I think we both understand it now, and we can decide from here what we want things to look like going forward." I picked my coffee back up, but it has to actually be different, not just said. "I know." Her voice was quiet. "Can I come visit sometime? See the property?" "Call me in a month," I said. "We'll figure out a time." Renee hasn't called. I don't know if she will. Greg filed for an LLC in Montana using a variation of Thomas's address 2 weeks after our meeting, apparently convinced there was still an angle. Robert Voss sent them a letter. The LLC was dissolved. I haven't heard from them since. Caleb turned 29 in July. I threw him a party, small. Some of his friends from town, Dale and his wife, a couple of Thomas's former colleagues who'd driven up from Missoula. We made a bonfire by the creek and stayed out until midnight telling Thomas stories. At one point, Caleb got quiet and looked at the fire for a while, and then said, "He planned this for us, didn't he? The whole thing." "He planned it for you," I said. "I just got lucky." "He talked about you every day," Caleb said. "Every single day there was some story about Uncle Harold. What you did when you were kids. Something you'd said on the phone. He kept a list of books he wanted to send you. He shook his head. He just never got around to sending them. I thought about the bookshelves in the cabin, filled with Thomas's books. I thought about my name in his letter, the careful handwriting, the instructions he'd written out the way he used to write field reports. Thorough, specific, leaving nothing to chance. He got around to the important ones, I said. It's September now. The aspens on the ridge above the east pasture have turned, the way Thomas always told me they would, pure gold against the dark evergreens, bright enough to look like something on fire. I ride out to the fence line in the mornings on a mare I bought from a ranch down the valley. A patient bay named Clara, who has more sense than most people I'd met. In the evenings, I sit on the porch and watch the mountains go through their colors and drink coffee that's too strong, the way Thomas always made it. I've been writing things down. Not a book exactly, more like a record. Stories about Thomas, about the land, about her father and grandfather, about the history of this particular piece of ground and the people who moved through it. 34 years of teaching history, and it turns out the story I most wanted to write was one I'd been part of my whole life without noticing. Caleb reads the drafts. He makes corrections where I get details wrong, dates, names, the specific timber variety in the north stand, and he doesn't say much else, but he keeps asking for the next section. Sandra came for a long weekend in August. She sat on the porch the first evening without saying much, watching the light change on the mountains, and I sat with her, and we didn't talk for a long time, which was better than a lot of conversations we'd had. She helped Caleb repaint the barn door on the second day. She was quiet and present in a way I hadn't seen from her in years. When she left, she hugged me at her car and held on for an extra moment. I don't know what she is now. Caleb's friend, maybe, or becoming one. My daughter again, possibly, in the way that relationship has to be rebuilt when it's been damaged. Slowly, with attention, without demanding that the damage be forgotten before it's been honestly reckoned with. I'm patient. Thomas was the most patient man I ever knew, and he raised me in part and lived in me in part, and I've got 340 acres of the most beautiful ground in Montana and no particular reason to rush anything. I talked to him last night, out loud, the way you do when someone is gone and the silence feels like it should hold a voice. I was sitting in his chair with his copy of A River Runs Through It, the one with his handwriting in the margins. I told him about Clara, and about the aspens, and about Sandra's visit and Renee's silence. I told him about the writing. I told him I was starting to understand what he'd known when he chose to spend 30 years out here, watching over country that most people never see, learning it the way you learn a person, patiently, without trying to own it. He knew me well enough to give me exactly what I needed, not just a place to land after things fell apart, but a reason to pay attention, to learn something new at 68, to find out who I was when no one was asking anything of me. I put the book down and looked out the window at the dark, and the stars over the Swan Range, more stars than I'd seen in 40 years of city living. And I said, thank you, the way you mean it when words feel insufficient. But you say them anyway. Tomorrow, I'm riding up to the north pasture with Caleb to look at the waterline there. Something's running slow, and I want to understand the system before winter. He's going to photograph the late wildflowers on the way up. He's been building a collection of the property through all 4 seasons, a record of this place across a full year. I've told him we should make a book of it someday. He said maybe. We have time. I've been thinking lately about what Thomas actually gave me. Not the land, not the cabin, not the $280,000 sitting in that trust. Those things matter, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But what I keep coming back to, sitting on this porch with the mountains going dark in the evenings, is that my brother gave me the chance to see clearly. And I'm not sure I would have chosen to see clearly on my own. Most of us don't. It's easier to keep the comfortable version of the people we love than to look at what's actually in front of us. Sandra called me 3 weeks after my brother died asking about square footage. Renee was already calculating her share before Thomas was in the ground. I'd spent years giving both of them the benefit of the doubt, telling myself they were just practical, just financially minded, that it wasn't what it looked like. Thomas never told me to stop doing that. He just built a structure that made the truth impossible to avoid. When you remove the money from the equation, what's left is the answer. And the answer, in my case, was Caleb, 28 years old, driving 400 miles to help me pack, asking nothing, fixing what needed fixing, reading my drafts without being asked. That's the thing about character. It shows up in ordinary moments, not dramatic ones. It shows up in who calls when there's nothing to gain. It shows up in who stays after the numbers don't add up. I spent 34 years teaching history, and the one thing that thread stays consistent across every period, every civilization, every story I ever put in front of a classroom is this: the choices people make when they think no one important is watching tell you everything about who they actually are. Sandra and Renee made their choices. I watched them make those choices, and then I made mine, not out of revenge. I want to be honest about that because it would be easier to frame it as a clean moral victory. And it wasn't. It was just grief and clarity, and finally deciding that protecting people from the consequences of their own behavior was not the same thing as loving them. There's a kind of courage that doesn't look like courage from the outside. It looks like a 68-year-old man loading a truck and driving to Montana. It looks like changing the beneficiary on a retirement account. It looks like sitting across from your daughters and telling them, quietly, that what they wanted was not going to happen. It doesn't feel heroic in the moment. It feels like loss, because it is loss. The loss of the story you'd been telling yourself about your family. The courage is in letting that story go anyway, because the true one is more worth living in. Thomas knew that. He built his whole life around it. 30 years of showing up for land and wildlife that couldn't thank him, raising a son alone without complaint, planning his affairs with the patience and thoroughness of a man who understood that most good things take longer than people want them to. He left me his land and his example, and honestly, the example is the more valuable of the two. I'm 68 years old and I'm learning to ride a horse. I'm writing things down. I'm having dinner with my nephew 4 nights a week, and watching him build a life that actually fits him. My daughter Sandra may yet become someone I trust again. That door's open, and I mean it to stay open. But the terms are different now. I know the difference between someone who loves you and someone who loves what you represent to them. I know it because Thomas made sure I couldn't avoid knowing it. That's the gift, not the acres, not the trust account. The clarity. Don't wait for someone to build you an escape hatch before you're willing to see what you're escaping. Look at who shows up when there's nothing in it for them. That person is your family, whatever the paperwork says.